Chair, Your Excellencies, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. Fidel Castro did not die. He is not dead. He lives on in all of us and in the lives of our children, even those yet unborn. He lives on amongst the masses of Cuba. He lives on in the barrios of Venezuela and in the mountains of Bolivia and Ecuador. He lives on in the fighters from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, from whose spokesperson we have just heard. He lives on amongst the workers' movement in Brazil. He lives on amongst the people of Vietnam, in whose epic struggle the Cuban people made an important contribution. He lives on amongst the people of the Congo, for whose freedom Che Guevara, leading a Cuban brigade, fought, and some died. He lives on amongst the people, above all, of South Africa, whose freedom from apartheid and organized institutional racism and race hatred, the Cuban armed forces under the leadership of Fidel Castro played a decisive role in defeating the apartheid army on the field of battle in Angola. Fidel Castro lives on amongst those cured of blindness in Operation Miracle. Fidel Castro lives on in the mountains of Kashmir, where the very first country, Pakistan, with no ideological or political connection to Cuba in the slightest, the first doctors, emergency responders, engineers, rescuers to arrive in the mountains of Kashmir were the Cuban responders, the Cuban doctors and nurses who came to the aid of the people of Pakistan. Fidel Castro lives on in West Africa, where the people stricken by the deadly disease of Ebola, when the Americans were sending troops to keep the sick people away, the Cubans were sending doctors and nurses to come to the aid of the people suffering from that dreadful disease. Fidel Castro lives on in the hopes and dreams of poor people everywhere. I have done interview after interview on radio and television and with newspaper men and women today, and many more to go before I sleep. Every single one, every one of the interviews has been dominated by the question of human rights. Let me say unequivocally, there are more human rights in Cuba than there are in any poor country anywhere in the world. There's the human right to live. There's the human right that when your child is born, it has more chance of surviving birth and infancy in Cuba than in the United States of America, 70 miles away and the richest country on the earth. There is the human right to a longer life expectancy in Cuba than in the United States of America itself. There's the human right for your child to go to a free kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, university, entirely free of charge in Cuba, a right which we don't even have now in our own country. In fact, we learned from the Thatcher papers released yesterday that she was planning in the 1980s to charge us for our health and education system. And of course, there's the right to eat. Margaret Thatcher took our milk away. In 1973, Cuban children are not just receiving milk, but receiving meat in free school dinners throughout every school and kindergarten in Cuba, in one of the poor countries in the world. There's the human right to be a ballet dancer if you've got the talent to be so, irrespective of which economic position you come. The human right to be a sportsman or a sportswoman, to be a scientist or to be a doctor. I told the story next door earlier. One of the best stories about Cuba I have ever heard. My friend, comrade John Bevan, he's not here today, he's out of the country, a fluent Spanish speaker, hired a car, drove far and wide in Cuba to places where foreign tourists never go. Coming along a road, he came upon two black women cane cutters with their machetes over their shoulders, making a long walk home. He gave them a lift. One of the women said how wonderful that foreigners are starting to come to this far corner of Cuba. Mind you, she said, more and more Cubans are traveling around the world. Really? Said John Bevan. Yes, she said. My daughter is a doctor abroad on an international mission, bringing medical care to poor people in other countries. Comrades, there is no other country in the world where the daughter of a black cane cutter would be anything other than a cane cutter herself. Never mind a doctor, never mind working overseas for the health of your people. Cuba was nothing except a casino and a bordello owned by the mafia before the Cuban Revolution. It was an early version of Trump Towers, where the Cuban people were debased and exploited, and where the best they could hope for was a job in one of the casinos or in one of those bordellos. And that's why these gold-toothed scarfaces are dancing in Miami today, because they think that they'll be going back to business as it was before. The greatest legacy of Fidel Castro is that Cuba will never, ever again be anybody's casino, anybody's bordello. It is a free country, thanks to the Cuban Revolution and its leader, Fidel Castro. I was asked, believe it or not, outside this door, just an hour ago, by an American journalist, what about torture in Cuba? I said the only place that there's torture in Cuba is in the American hellhole called Guantanamo Bay, illegally occupied and torturing people by the day and by the hour. Of course, there are restrictions on democratic freedoms in Cuba. How could it be otherwise? Cuba has been besieged by the most powerful country in the world, just 70 miles away from the first day of the Cuban Revolution. Hundreds upon hundreds of efforts were made to murder the leader of the Cuban Revolution, who outlasted 10 American presidents. And by the way, I say to the idiot, savant Trump in his tower, who's exulting today, Fidel Castro will be remembered long after you're a figure of fun in the dustbin of history, Mr. Trump. There wasn't many liberty and freedoms here in Britain when the enemy was at the gate, in the Channel ports, threatening to invade us, trying to bring us down. There were no elections, there was no free speech, there were no civil liberties, because the people had to be united against the foreign invader lying just 20 miles off our coast. If people in America, if liberals in England want to see an end to restrictions on civil liberties of a political kind in Cuba, they should demand an end to the blockade of Cuba, to the subversion of Cuba, and to the threat of invasion in Cuba. With all respect, and I apologize to all those other strugglers from all those other Latin American countries who are gathered here today, and we are gathered here in solidarity with you. But I wanted to spend my time talking about one of the greatest human beings who ever lived, who ever walked this earth. We were privileged to live in his era. Some of us were privileged to be his comrade and friend and to spend many, many hours with him. He is not gone. Hasta la victoria siempre. Comandante Fidel Castro, presente! Fidel Castro isn't dead. He lives on in all of us, in all of our children. He lives on in the masses in Cuba and throughout Latin America and throughout the poor masses of the world. He lives on in South Africa, free because of the struggle of the people of South Africa and their allies, the most important of which was Cuba under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro lives on in the hopes and dreams of every poor person for a better life. In every single interview that I have done today, and I have done many, I have lost count of them, I have been relentlessly grilled about human rights. But as Fidel Castro himself said, we hear a lot of talk about human rights. But what about the rights of humanity? Why should some children walk barefoot while others are expensively clad and transported? Why should some live but 35 or 40 years while others live 80 or more? Why should some live lives of richness and variety while others live lives of grim and unrelenting poverty? That is a human rights question. It is a human rights question as to whether your child will survive its birth and infancy. Children born in Cuba, thanks to the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro,
have a greater chance of life than the children born in Washington, D.C. Official. People who do survive their infancy will live a longer life in Cuba than they will in Washington, D.C. These too are human rights. Of course, there are restrictions on some political freedoms in Cuba. How could it be otherwise when Cuba has, throughout the entire existence of the revolution, been a country under siege, assailed, besieged and subverted, even to the point of foreign military invasion by its mighty neighbor only 90 miles away. Fidel Castro saw off 10 American presidents, each one of whom was dedicated to murdering him and destroying the revolutionary process. Hundreds upon hundreds of attempts were made to assassinate the president of Cuba, Fidel Castro. And the latest American president, the idiot savant Donald Trump, tweeted this morning that Fidel Castro was dead. Well, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world today who are mourning the passing of Fidel Castro. And there are hundreds of millions of people who don't know whether to laugh or cry at the idea of the idiot Trump in his golden tower in New York being the so-called leader of the so-called free world. That's the truth of the matter. I could go on at very great length, and I will. I'm going to hold an event next weekend at which I shall give a fuller, longer tribute to Fidel Castro than I can today, so look out for that if you are interested. But someone just asked me from Associated Press outside, that was after 7 straight questions about human rights, what was the greatest legacy? Of course, I tried to tour the horizon of Cuba's achievements inside their own country, some of which I have alluded to already. But the greatest legacy is the internationalism of the Cuban Revolution. And Rob knows this well, as does Bob. The Cubans always thank you for the solidarity that we, in our own way, give to them. But the truth is, it's we who should be thanking them. Because the reason that the gold-toothed Scarfaces in Miami are dancing today are precisely the reasons why we are mourning. Before the Cuban Revolution, the mafia ruled Cuba. The mafia had bought and paid for the dictator of Cuba, Al Capone, Traficante, Mayor Lansky, all these criminal casino peddlers and brothel keepers had reduced Cuba to not just a state, of penury and servitude, with actual apartheid in place against black people in Cuba. But for them, Cuba wasn't a country at all. It was just a kind of early Trump Towers, where the worst people in the world could exercise their lust and their vice. The Cuban people meant nothing to them. And Cuba was a byword for misery and for oppression. How different today from then. As I tried to explain to my young interviewer from Associated Press, Cuba is the coolest place on the planet. There are more people have been there or want to go there than anywhere else in the world. Certainly far more than want to go to Miami. Certainly a second time. Cuba has become famous throughout the world, not just for its own achievements, but for its internationalism. In Kashmir, when there was an earthquake, who were the first rescuers, the first engineers, the first constructors, the first doctors to enter the earthquake-stricken zone of Pakistan, a country with no ideological affinity with Cuba at all? You know the answer. The Cubans were the first. When Ebola struck West Africa and the Americans were sending troops to keep the stricken people at bay, the Cubans were sending doctors in their hundreds to move amongst the infected people to try to cure them. Who has cured more blind people on the earth than Cuba? What's that operation, Rob?
Operation Miracle.
Operation Miracle. Treating any and all and for free, giving them the gift of sight, which in many cases they had never had, without a penny changing hands, without any kind of political conditions. Even one of the murderers of Comandante Che Guevara had his sight restored in Operation Miracle. Who left their bones in Angola? Who left their bones in Grenada? Who left their bones in the Congo, in Vietnam, on the Golan Heights in Syria, where a brigade fought the Israeli army? The Cubans left their bones and their blood. There is no country on earth like Cuba, and it will be remembered, Trump, when you are long forgotten and in the dustbin of history. Long forgotten. So what happens now? Well, the ambassador, if she makes it back, will tell us. But I feel absolutely confident that the Cubans will never agree to return to the days before the Cuban Revolution. They will never re-inherit the emigres, the brothel keepers, the casino owners, and the mafia gangs that they defeated. I am absolutely confident. You know, on a clear day, you can see Haiti from Cuba, where the people are forced to live in a sink of misery. immiseration, robbed by a corrupt political class and their allies for decades. I close with one anecdote which I had forgotten that I used to use, but one of my friends reminded me today. One of our comrades, John Bevan, was travelling in a hired car in a very remote part of Cuba, and he saw two black women cane cutters with their machetes over their shoulders on a long walk home from the fields. He's a fluent Spanish speaker. He stopped to give them a lift. One of the women said, "It's wonderful that foreign visitors are coming now to these far-flung parts of Cuba. Mind you," she said, "many Cubans are traveling far afield now. My daughter," she said, daughter of a black woman cane cutter, "my daughter is abroad. She's a doctor working on an international mission. There is no other place, probably in the entire world, where the black daughter of a cane cutter is a doctor and is working for free for other people around the world." Viva Cuba! God bless Fidel Castro!
Thank you very much, George. It's always a great pleasure to hear you speak, and you've been a great supporter of the campaign for a number of years, and thank you for that.